So it's not exactly about the ship you saw in the photos. It's actually about a number sitting behind it that almost nobody reported. Understand what happened here first, and understand why almost every outlet covering it missed the number that actually explains it. A shipyard on the Shanghai waterfront put a converted cargo vessel on public display. 60 containerized missile launch cells welded to the deck. Radar and weapon systems out in the open. Most of the coverage on this focused entirely on that one ship, on the missiles, on the hardware. I want to show you the number that actually explains why this ship exists at all. Because once you see it, the ship stops looking like the story and starts looking like a symptom of something much bigger. If you're new to the channel, take a second and subscribe and hit the bell, because this channel exists to find exactly this kind of number, the one hiding in plain sight that changes how you read everything else in the story. I've spent years working commercial vessels and doing maritime analysis, and the number I'm about to show you is one of the starkest I've come across in a long time. Where are you watching this from? This number affects shipbuilding, trade, and defense capacity for basically every country with a coastline. So tell me your country down in the comments. Let's orient ourselves here before we get into this, because the number only makes sense once you understand the ship it's attached to. The vessel is called the Zhongchuan, 97 meters long, tracked since 2024, operating so far only inside Chinese coastal waters. She was photographed at the Hudong Zhonghua shipyard in Shanghai, with her transponder live and current, meaning this was a deliberate display, not a leak. On deck sit rows of standard 40-foot containers, each holding 4 vertical launch tubes, 5 containers across, 3 rows deep, adding up to roughly 60 launch cells, alongside phased array radar, close-in weapon systems, chaff launchers, and what look like inflatable surface decoys built to broadcast false radar signatures once deployed. That's the ship. Real. Tracked. Sitting at a pier right now if you check marine traffic. One more detail on the ship itself worth mentioning. Observers online noticed a set of large canisters on deck and guessed they were life rafts. I don't think that's right. They're too large for standard life rafts given the crew size a ship like this would carry. My read is that these are surface decoys, inflatable units meant to deploy and broadcast a false radar signature, so they register as additional vessels on somebody's screen. If that's accurate, even the individual ship is designed around the same principle the capacity number describes at a national scale. Multiply the number of things an observer has to account for, and you multiply the difficulty of responding to any single one of them. Here's the number. A slide released by the United States Office of Naval Intelligence, now widely cited across defense reporting, put China's total commercial shipbuilding capacity at roughly 200 times that of the United States. Not twice, not 10 times, roughly 200 times. Sit with that for a second, because most comparisons between two rival powers involve gaps you can at least picture. One side twice as strong, 3 times as many units. Something you can hold in your head. A 200 times gap is not really a gap anymore. It's a different category entirely. Let's put more texture on that number, because a single slide from one intelligence office deserves context rather than blind repetition. As of 2024, China was already responsible for slightly more than half of all commercial ships built anywhere in the world. Order books for 2025 show China holding more than 60% of new global ship orders. That means more than 6 out of every 10 new commercial ships being ordered on the planet right now are going to a Chinese shipyard. The United States, by comparison, builds a small enough fraction of global commercial tonnage that it barely registers on the same chart. This isn't a story about a Chinese shipbuilding advantage. It's a story about American commercial shipbuilding capacity having quietly disappeared over the past several decades, while almost nobody outside the industry noticed. Let's also talk about why the American decline happened in more concrete terms, because "we lost the industry" is too vague to actually explain anything. After the Second World War, the United States had by far the largest shipbuilding industry in the world, built up almost entirely to support wartime production. Once that wartime demand disappeared, commercial shipbuilding in the US had to compete on cost with countries that offered cheaper labor and heavier state support for their shipyards, first Japan, then South Korea, and eventually China. American shipyards increasingly specialized in military work instead, protected from foreign competition by law, while commercial shipbuilding simply stopped being cost competitive on the open market. Over decades, fewer commercial orders meant fewer shipyards stayed open, which meant fewer skilled workers were trained, which meant even less capacity to compete for the orders that remained. That's a self-reinforcing decline, and it's exactly the kind of decline that doesn't reverse on a normal political timeline, because every part of the system that would need to grow back depends on every other part already existing. That disappearance didn't happen overnight, and it's worth understanding why, because it's the other half of this number. American commercial shipbuilding was, for a long stretch of the 20th century, a real global industry. Labor costs, regulatory structure, and a shift towards specialized military shipbuilding over commercial shipbuilding all played a role in shrinking it over time, along with the simple fact that once a country's shipyards stopped building large numbers of commercial hulls, the skilled workforce, the supply chains, and the specialized tooling required to build ships at scale all atrophy together. You can't just decide to rebuild that capacity with a single piece of legislation. It takes years of sustained investment in workers, facilities, and supply chains that once lost are genuinely difficult to recover. China took the opposite path deliberately. Chinese commercial shipbuilding has been treated as a strategic national priority for roughly 2 decades, backed by heavy state subsidy, dedicated industrial policy, and enormous investment in shipyard capacity, skilled labor, and steel production, specifically aimed at dominating global shipbuilding. That is not a side effect of general economic growth. It was a chosen outcome, pursued with the same seriousness a country might apply to a weapons program, because in practical terms, that's exactly what shipbuilding capacity turns into the moment you need it to. Now, let's connect that number back to the ship, because this is where the pattern actually clicks into place. A country that builds slightly more than half the world's commercial ships and holds more than 60% of current orders does not need to build a dedicated warship from scratch every time it wants additional strike capability at sea. It can simply take a fraction of the commercial hulls it is already producing at massive scale and convert them. The Zhongchuan 79 isn't remarkable because of what's welded to its deck. It's remarkable because it demonstrates how quickly and cheaply that conversion can happen when the underlying shipbuilding base is this large. If China decided to convert even a small percentage of its annual commercial output the same way, you would not be talking about one armed cargo ship. You would be talking about dozens, potentially hundreds, of comparable hulls entering service in a single year, something no other country on Earth currently has the industrial capacity to match, let alone counter at the same pace. Let's get specific about what 200 times actually means in practice, because the raw multiple can be hard to picture without a concrete comparison. Imagine 2 shipyards operating side by side, one Chinese, one American, each capable of laying down and completing a similar-sized commercial hull. If the American yard completes one ship in a given period, the Chinese shipbuilding base, in aggregate across its many yards, is completing roughly 200 ships in that same period. That's not one yard outproducing another. That's an entire national industry, operating at a scale the United States simply does not have the shipyards, the workforce, or the steel production to match, even if it wanted to start tomorrow. That gap also shows up directly in crew and cost requirements once you connect it back to the missile ship. A standard vertical launch cell on an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer holds one large missile per tube, typically something built for long-range strikes or major air defense interceptors. What China is using on the Zhongchuan 79 is a smaller containerized version, 4 launch tubes packed into a single 40-foot box, getting you to roughly 60 cells total, compared to roughly 122 cells on a Ticonderoga-class cruiser. A destroyer needs a trained crew in the low hundreds to operate, maintain, and fight it. A converted merchant hull needs a fraction of that crew, because you are not asking it to maneuver in combat. You are asking it to sit, launch, and either survive or not. None of that math works in China's favor without the underlying shipbuilding base to produce the hulls cheaply and quickly in the first place. The number is the reason the ship is affordable at all. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this is the actual debate hiding underneath the missile story. If the real threat isn't one armed cargo ship, but the industrial capacity to produce 100 more of them whenever the order comes down, does sinking or countering a single converted vessel even matter strategically? Or is the entire conversation about individual ships missing the actual point? Hold that thought. Let's push on that question a little further, because it connects to a real disagreement inside American defense planning that rarely makes it into public conversation. Some planners argue the US should focus resources on countering individual threats as they appear. Better sensors, better interceptors, faster response times against whatever shows up. Others argue that approach is a losing game against a shipbuilding gap this large, because you end up spending enormous sums reacting to a capacity advantage you can never fully offset one interceptor at a time. The second group tends to argue the only real answer is addressing the industrial gap itself, even knowing that's a decade-long project with no guarantee of full success. Neither camp has a clean answer, and that's exactly why this number matters more than any single ship does. There's also a detection consequence to this number that most coverage of the ship completely skipped over. Even a small percentage of a shipbuilding output this large, converted, and blended into ordinary commercial traffic, creates an enormous problem for anyone trying to track it. Go check marine traffic yourself and look at how packed a major global sea lane already is on any given day. Finding a handful of converted hulls hiding inside that traffic, especially before they do anything, is a genuinely hard analytical problem. Even with satellite coverage, radar tracking, and artificial intelligence sorting through the data. We already see a milder version of this problem with the so-called dark fleet, the sanctioned tankers running without transponders to dodge oil sanctions. A converted merchant cruiser is arguably a harder case than a dark fleet tanker, because it doesn't need to hide at all. It can transmit its position normally, look completely ordinary, and still be carrying 60 missile launch cells nobody outside the crew knows about until it matters. A shipbuilding base large enough to produce 200 ships for everyone an adversary produces doesn't just buy more hulls. It buys a much larger haystack to hide those hulls inside. Let's widen this out beyond just warship conversions, because the same 200 times gap shows up in other places once you start looking for it, and it changes how you should read a lot of other maritime headlines. China has used its commercial shipbuilding dominance to develop specialized civilian coastal ferries with direct military application already engineered into the design, including the capacity to carry tanks and heavy vehicles, according to reporting from War on the Rocks. Alongside those ferries sit specialized landing barges designed to let commercial vessels tie up alongside them and bridge together, creating a rapid over-the-beach unloading capability most naturally suited to an amphibious landing operation. The kind of capability that gets discussed constantly in the context of Taiwan. China has also adapted select heavy-lift ships, normally used to transport other ships and large port cranes, into auxiliary helicopter platforms for vertical envelopment missions when needed. None of these programs would be remotely affordable or fast to field for a country without China's shipbuilding scale behind them. The number explains all of it, not just the one missile ship that made headlines this week. China is not alone in the idea of disguising weapons inside ordinary commercial equipment, and it's worth being clear about that, so this doesn't sound like a uniquely Chinese trick. The United States Army has fielded a counter-drone system that pops directly out of a standard shipping container. Reporting around a presidential visit to Fort Bragg noted unusual guided rocket launchers positioned nearby inside shipping containers during the event. Ukraine's long-range drone strikes deep into Russian territory earlier this year relied in part on drones launched from modified truck trailers, a related idea applied on land instead of at sea. The concept itself is proven and repeatable everywhere. What separates China's version from every other example is scale, because nobody else has anywhere close to the shipbuilding capacity needed to turn a clever trick into a standing force, numbering potentially in the hundreds of hulls. There's also a deeper historical reason China's approach to commercial and military shipping integration looks the way it does, and understanding it helps explain why the United States never built anything comparable. You have to go back to the British Navy in the 19th and early 20th centuries to find a similar level of fusion between commercial shipping and national military planning. Britain needed more cruisers than it had to patrol its sea lanes during the First World War, so it took merchant vessels, mounted guns, swapped crews, and sent them out as armed merchant cruisers, openly registered and publicly known as such. China's version goes further because it isn't a wartime improvisation drawing on an already large merchant fleet. It's a peacetime industrial strategy that guarantees the merchant fleet stays enormous and available in the first place. Companies like COSCO, the largest shipping line in the world across containers, heavy lift cargo, bulk carriers, and tankers, operate with a political officer aboard every vessel of any real size. A detail that tells you the line between commercial shipping and state interest was never meant to be a hard one in China's system. The Naval War College's China Maritime Studies Institute publishes detailed quarterly reviews and reports specifically tracking this relationship, if you want to go deeper on the research yourself. There's a comparison worth making to other industries here too, because a 200 times gap sounds abstract until you place it next to something people already understand instinctively. Imagine one country building slightly more than half the world's smartphones while its closest rival builds a rounding error's worth by comparison. Nobody would call that a competitive market. They'd call it dominance. And they'd expect that dominant producer to set the terms for everyone else in the industry eventually. Shipbuilding doesn't get the same attention smartphones do, because most people never think about who built the hull carrying their imported goods across the ocean. But the scale of dominance described by this number is genuinely comparable, and it applies to an industry that happens to double as the foundation for naval power. Let's talk about what closing a 200 times gap would actually require, because it's worth being honest about the scale of the problem rather than treating it as a simple policy fix. You cannot fund your way out of a shipbuilding capacity gap this large with a single defense bill. Shipyards take years to build or expand. Skilled welders, pipe fitters, and marine engineers take years to train, and that workforce has to exist somewhere with steady commercial demand to justify keeping them employed between military contracts. Steel production capacity has to scale alongside all of that. The United States Navy has announced 2 major new shipbuilding programs recently. A new strike cruiser class expected to cost billions of dollars per hull with a multi-year build timeline, and a frigate replacement based on an offshore patrol vessel design expected to take roughly 2 years just to outfit for additional capability. Both programs are aimed at building better individual ships. Neither one touches the underlying industrial capacity gap that the 200 times number describes, because that gap isn't really about ship design at all. It's about how many shipyards, workers, and tons of steel a country can put to work building hulls in a given year. And that is a fundamentally different problem than designing one very good warship. There's also a workforce dimension to this that's easy to overlook if you only think in terms of steel and shipyards. Building ships at China's pace requires an enormous, continuously trained pool of welders, pipe fitters, electricians, and marine engineers. And that workforce only stays skilled and available if there's steady commercial demand keeping them employed year-round. The United States doesn't just lack the shipyards, it lacks the pipeline of people trained to work in them at this scale. And rebuilding a skilled trade workforce this large takes even longer than building physical shipyard capacity, because you can pour concrete and erect a crane faster than you can train a generation of skilled tradespeople from scratch. Here's what makes this genuinely uncomfortable if you sit with it long enough. Even if the United States announced tomorrow that it was going to rebuild its commercial shipbuilding base to close this gap, the earliest realistic timeline for meaningfully narrowing a 200 times capacity difference would be measured in a decade or more, not years. Shipyards, workforce pipelines, and steel supply chains simply do not scale on a faster timeline than that, no matter how much money gets thrown at the problem in year one. That means the current gap isn't a snapshot of where things stand today. It's closer to a floor for how large the gap will remain for at least the next several years, regardless of what policy decisions get made starting now. I want to be fair to the other side of this conversation too, because there's a real counter-argument worth taking seriously. Some analysts argue that raw shipbuilding tonnage overstates the actual military threat, because most of that Chinese commercial output is bulk carriers, tankers, and container ships built for ordinary trade, not warships. And converting commercial hulls into combat platforms, even cheaply, still produces ships that are individually far less capable than a purpose-built destroyer or cruiser. That's a fair point, and it's part of why the Zhongchuan 79 carries roughly half the launch cells of a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, despite being built for a tiny fraction of the cost. But that argument misses what the number is actually describing. It was never a claim that every commercial ship China builds is secretly a warship. It's a claim about latent capacity, the ability to convert a meaningful fraction of an enormous commercial output into military use quickly, if the decision is ever made to do so. A capability doesn't need to be exercised at full scale to matter strategically. It only needs to exist, be demonstrated once, and be understood by everyone watching to be real. I'd also push back gently on anyone who thinks this number is somehow exaggerated for dramatic effect. It comes from the Office of Naval Intelligence, a U.S. government body with every institutional incentive to be conservative rather than alarmist in its public assessments, and it has been repeated consistently across multiple independent defense outlets since it was first released. Numbers this stark don't need embellishment to be alarming. The plain figure does that on its own. In my opinion, as someone who has spent years around commercial and military vessels, the 200 times number is the single most important fact in this entire story. More important than the missile count, more important than the ship's name, more important than anything visible in the photographs that circulated this week. Ships get built, get damaged, get retired. Industrial capacity is what determines how fast a country can replace what it loses, and how fast it can scale up when circumstances change. And right now, that capacity sits overwhelmingly on one side of the Pacific. The Zhongchuan 79 will eventually be scrapped or replaced by something newer. The shipyard that built her, and the roughly 200 times greater capacity behind it, will still be there afterward, ready to build whatever comes next. I'll put it this way to close out my read on this. Every time a story like this circulates, the conversation defaults to arguing about one ship, its weapons, its range, whether it could be sunk in a single strike. Those are all legitimate questions, and I've spent most of this video answering them. But the number sitting behind the ship is the one that actually predicts what happens next. Not this week, but over the next 5 or 10 years. And that's the number almost nobody is putting front and center when this story gets covered. So here's the question I actually want you to argue about in the comments. Given a gap this large, should the United States treat this as an emergency worth committing serious, sustained investment to over the next decade, even knowing it likely won't fully close the gap? Or is that investment better spent doubling down on higher quality individual platforms and alliance-based solutions, working with shipbuilding partners like South Korea and Japan, rather than trying to rebuild American commercial shipbuilding capacity from scratch? Tell me where you land, and tell me why. That's it for this episode. Until next time, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, drop a comment, and share this with somebody who still thinks this story was only about one ship, because the number behind it is the part that actually deserves the headline. If you want to support the channel directly, the Super Thanks button is right below, or you can find me on Patreon. Until the next episode,